This time I'm teaching the words of my perfect teacher more extensively, so it is taking longer to complete. In terms of content, I'm trying my best to add some instructions that I know. Hopefully, they will be of help and benefit to your practice. Please prioritize the study of this text, and most importantly, please put the corresponding teachings into real practice. Throughout this year's study, it is a must that you generate conviction about the content pertaining to the common preliminaries. In the past, in Tibetan or Han areas, there were teachers who taught the words of my perfect teacher and disciples who learned the text. Nevertheless, it was very rare that a teacher guided ngondro practice and practiced with disciples at the same time. Therefore, after careful consideration over a long period of time, I decided to allocate time to take you through your practice of ngondro. Otherwise, if you only talk the talk without walking the talk, the teaching won't infiltrate your minds. Then it will be very hard for you to deal with your defilements and afflictions. Therefore, given this opportunity, I repeatedly urge those Dharma students who have the right conditions and time to practice in sitting sessions. In particular, you should establish a solid foundation through good practice on the 4 common preliminaries, or the 4 thoughts: the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages, the impermanence of life, the defects of samsara, and the principle of cause and effect. Of course, whether or not the foundation is well laid down depends crucially on yourself. Your practice shouldn't be driven by extrinsic obligation or coercion. While such extrinsic methods may have pushed you to practice a bit, what is most crucial is your ability to engage in the practice on your own. Without a solid foundation of ngondro, even if we may have temporarily gained some experience or have achieved a certain state through engaging in a specific practice, since our mind cannot resonate with the 4 thoughts, we can hardly get any real benefit in our pursuit of liberation. This is certain. After all, many of us have been studying the Dharma for many years, so we should know this very well. As for me, although I am not a great practitioner or a Mahasiddha, at least I am a bit familiar with the Buddha's teachings, especially the teachings of the Nyingma tradition, and I've also put the teachings into real practice. Through my own experience and observation over the years, I truly realize that without a real understanding of the ngondro teachings and a sustained practice of each teaching, one's practice cannot be successful. If you depart from the preliminaries, no matter how many teachers you follow, how many Dharma books you read, how many lineages you become involved in, at most you just plant the root of merit in your mind. Without the preliminaries, it will be extremely hard for you to uproot the causes of samsara. Now that we have the opportunity to practice ngondro, please make sure you don't miss the opportunity. It is fine if you put aside other teachings and practices for now, but you must devote yourself wholeheartedly to the practice of 4 thoughts, including the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages, the impermanence of life, and so forth. Recently, while teaching the words of my perfect teacher in class, I also taught the guided meditative instructions of Longchen Pa's The Meaning Instructions on 3 Virtues of Relaxation in the Natural State of the Mind, a heart essence of the practical instructions of Longchen Nyingtik. Currently, the Sangha is done with meditating on the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages. But here I ask you to continue doing this meditation for another 2 or 3 months. In addition, keep your prostration practice ongoing. This year and next year, my plan is to set aside some time for Dharma students of the victorious Subdu Mara land so that you can devote yourselves to the ngondro practice. Meanwhile, you should continue your hearing, contemplating, and meditating. Human life is rare and transitory. I hope you will develop conviction about the common preliminaries through 2 years of practice. If one just sticks to the literal intellectual meaning of the text, not to mention intellectuals, even a third or fourth grader can easily speak about the content. There are many primary school students studying Dharma in the northeast of China who seem to present the teachings of the words of my perfect teacher better than I do. But I believe they don't put the teachings into practice as well as I do. Although I cannot say that I practice ngondro well, at least I have been practicing unceasingly. Those presenters can only talk about the teachings. For example, why is human life precious? Or what are the 8 intrusive circumstances that leave no freedom to practice the Dharma? However, they don't reflect on the freedoms and advantages carefully to see whether or not they have them. They don't know that if some aspects are missing, they should try to acquire them by whatever means possible. Whereas if they have them all, they should further examine whether these freedoms and advantages are with them temporarily or for the rest of this life. Only a person with practice experience will know how to apply these special examining methods. Therefore, recently, I've asked you, including volunteer staff members who serve the Sangha or help others, to meditate every morning on the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages. This is not hard to do. As long as you have conviction about the Dharma, you won't like to oversleep or engage in trifles. The reason you clung to these things in the past is that you didn't develop deep conviction about rebirth and the preciousness of the human form. That's why you always found an excuse not to study the Dharma, or even if you studied, you only did it heedlessly. What a pity. Some householders I know always put off studying the Dharma on the excuse of being busy. Since they don't study the Dharma, there is nothing to say about their practice. Not many people these days study the Dharma. Then among Dharma students, many just stay on the surface without delving deeper. So very few Buddhists follow the sequence and really practice step by step. Many Buddhists go after higher teachings right away, and they like to talk about things such as, have you received the empowerment of Lama Nyingtik, the innermost heart drop of the Guru? Have you received the empowerment of Yamantaka? And so forth. They think receiving the highest empowerment means they can attain enlightenment in this very life, so they can swiftly fly to a pure realm, today to the blissful realm, and tomorrow to the copper-colored mountain of glory. They like the idea of flying around, what a great joy. However, they are reluctant to engage in ngondro practice, unaware that although ngondro refers to a set of preliminary practices, it is actually the most crucial and fundamental practice. Recently, I gave the transmission of the neck pouch Vajrakalaya, and the recipients showed great faith. On that day, Vajrakalayas, or ritual daggers, were all sold out at Larangar. On the next day, the daggers were sold out in Sirtar County. It happened to be a national holiday during that time, and I was told the daggers at Buddhist stores in cities like Chengdu and Beijing were also sold out. Some people, including monks, even carry long ritual daggers on their waists, just like a Kampa or a native of Kham carries his Tibetan knife. This shows that they are very attached to possessing such a dagger. Practicing Vajrakiliya does bring inconceivable merit, but sadly, some people don't even know exactly what Vajrakiliya is or how to practice the generation stage and the completion stage. They just find Vajrakiliya nice looking and think it can subdue evil forces, so maybe they can use the dagger to repel the troublemakers. Do they think like this? I don't really know, because I don't have the clear knowing of the minds of others. Sadly, I rarely hear someone place great importance on the words of my perfect teacher, thinking the text is the most important thing in their life, and carrying a copy with them for frequent consultation. I am afraid there is no such person among us. If you don't agree with me, please raise your hands, and we will see how many hands are in the air. Therefore, it seems you don't pay enough attention to the words of my perfect teacher unlike most of the Buddhist practitioners of my generation? Well, perhaps it's because you have superior faculties, so you take the top-down approach. You start from the fruition downwards, whereas practitioners of my generation have inferior faculties, so we choose the bottom-up approach, starting from ngondro upwards. When we first encountered the words of my perfect teacher, we would start by steadily practicing the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages until we gradually attained the state of the practice. Thanks to the solid foundation we built through the preliminary practices, 20 years after we first encountered the ngondro teaching, we are still at Larangar. In comparison, some people who took ordination roughly around the same time as us failed miserably in their practice because they only went after higher teachings. Therefore, please grasp this opportunity and don't let it slip away. Although I am not a good practitioner, I decided to guide your practice in person and have set aside significant time for this. During this long period, I hope each of you will establish a solid foundation through the preliminary practices. Our human life is truly rare and precious. In our short life, how many opportunities do we have to practice ngondro? Not many, I'm afraid. Perhaps this is the first time as well as the last time in this life for you to practice ngondro in such an extensive manner. Perhaps this is the first time as well as the last time for me to guide you through the ngondro practice. Take, for example, the practice on the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages. Through your meditation, make sure you truly feel that having a human form is very rare and precious. This feeling should come from the bottom of your heart, not as a pretense. If you do feel this way, then when you see countless beings not studying the Dharma, you will feel sorry for them. Meanwhile, you should use your human form to practice diligently instead of wasting your precious human life. My goal is to help you reach this state of practice. I myself am an ordinary person with inferior qualities, so I cannot guarantee that a few hundred of you will attain realization and become first Bhumi Bodhisattvas right after completing your ngondro practice. Moreover, we are currently in the degenerate age, and the fruition period of the Dharma has long passed, so swift realization is no longer possible. Nevertheless, as long as each of you lay a solid foundation, your practice will not waver or regress in this life. This will create an extremely supreme dependent arising for all future lives. When I visit Han areas, I sometimes chat with home practitioners and monastics who have been studying the Dharma for many years. Often, I don't hear them express concern about their next lives. All I hear from them is about the goodness of this life, clairvoyance, or miracles. Worse yet, when talking about politics, they can eloquently refer to many political terms. But when discussing the Dharma, especially the topic of karma, they remain silent. This is concerning. We must know that the purpose of studying the Dharma is to assimilate the teachings into our minds, just as lineage masters pass on the Dharma from generation to generation. Now let's begin today's teaching. I don't cover too much of the content of the words of my perfect teacher in my everyday teaching. I often expand on my explanations of the text, so sometimes my teaching may not be coherent or have a clear logical flow. But the text itself has supreme blessing power, so I hope you always carry a copy with you. Through studying the way of the Bodhisattva, we gain a general understanding of Mahayana Buddhism and learn about the merits and benefits of generating bodhicitta. Through studying the words of my perfect teacher, we are further equipped with practical pith instructions on how to counteract afflictions and eradicate self-clinging. Meanwhile, with the invisible blessings of lineage masters, when causes and conditions come together, compassion, wisdom, and other signs of effective practice will definitely arise in our minds. Let's continue with Patrul Rinpoche's text, until all 16 factors that leave no opportunity for practice have been thoroughly examined and eliminated. Individuals in this degenerate age may appear to possess all the freedoms and advantages and seemingly embody true practitioners of the Dharma. However, whether it be the lineage holder on his throne, the Lama beneath his parasol, the hermit in his mountain solitude, the one who has renounced worldly affairs, or anyone who holds an inflated self-importance, all may believe they are engaged in the practice of Dharma. Nevertheless, as long as these additional constraints continue to exert their influence, they are not truly on the correct path. This paragraph is very important. Without careful examination, many practitioners may fool themselves and deceive others. Such practitioners think highly of themselves. I am not an ordinary lay practitioner, or I am not an ordinary monastic. They think of themselves as high-ranking lamas, Dharma kings, great tulkus, or mahasiddhas, who always live in the respect, praise, flowers, and applause of others, real qualified teachers of the Dharma. However, if their mind stream is constrained by the 16 additional conditions, including stupidity, emotional turmoil, heedlessness of the vows and of the samayas, they are not considered to have even entered the Dharma, let alone liberate all beings. Many Han Chinese lay practitioners show great respect to me, but since I often examine myself, I know I am not impeccable. Therefore, these lay practitioners may in some ways overestimate me, as I am just an ordinary monk. There must be similar situations wherein we have not noticed our faults. For example, someone remains in the Sangha but isn't upholding pure precepts, or someone is sitting on the Dharma seat but isn't managing Sangha affairs in accordance with Vinaya. In such cases, there is only one outcome for this person's next life: to have a bad rebirth as a hell being, a hungry ghost, or an animal. In fact, there are many instances of practitioners falling into the lower realms. Here is a story from the Chronicles of Mount Wutai. In the Tang dynasty, a monk named Fa Ai had been a temple overseer at Mount Wutai for 20 years. But with the Sangha's money, he privately bought a large piece of land and left it to his disciple Ming Hui. When Fa Ai died, he was reborn as an ox in Ming Hui's family, and the ox was so full of strength that it could plow alone. 30 years later, the ox was old, so the farmer in charge wanted to sell it. On that night, Ming Hui had a dream in which his late master cried and said, "I bought the land for you with the Sangha's money, so I was reborn as an ox, and now I am old and weak. I hope you will skin me for a drum and put my name on it. Whenever there is a ritual of worship or recitation, please hit this drum. By doing so, my suffering will be relieved, and I will have the opportunity for liberation. Otherwise, even when the land becomes an ocean, I may still not get liberated." Then the ox threw itself against a tree and died. Ming Hui was scared, so he woke up at midnight to gather the Sangha immediately and told them what happened. Following the instructions in his dream, Ming Hui skinned the ox, made a drum out of the leather, and put his master's name on it. He sold the land and offered all the money to the Sangha. Later, this drum was sent to Manjushri Hall at Mount Wutai, and upon hearing its story, people started to call it the human skin drum. We can imagine Fa Ai must have received great respect from others during his life. But why was he reborn as an ox? It was because he lacked conviction in basic views, such as the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages, and the law of karma. As a result, he recklessly committed many wrongdoings, which led to his bad rebirth as an ox. Here is a story from the memoirs of eminent monks. Shide used to herd the cattle for the Guoqing temple. One day when the Sangha was engaging in the Upasatha practice, Shide brought oxen to the front of the Dharma hall and started to clap hands and laugh. It disturbed the Sangha, so a monk expelled him out with a stick. Shide said, "From now on, I will never herd the cattle." A monk asked, "What are you going to do instead of herding the cattle?" "One cannot just eat without working here." "Yes," replied Shide, "these oxen used to be those who ate without working in their previous life. They were the high-ranking masters and administrative monks in this temple." The Sangha didn't believe him, so Shide shouted out names to the cattle, one by one in front of the Sangha. "Vinaya Master Hong Jing, please step forward." Hearing this, a white ox walked out with a moo. Shide continued, "Temple Chef Guang Chao, please step forward." Hearing this, a black cow walked out with a moo. Seeing this, the Sangha was shocked. Shide pointed to the cattle and said a verse. "In the previous life, you didn't uphold precepts. You had a human face, yet an animal heart. In this life, you end up suffering this way. Who do you resent for this?" The Sangha was petrified after hearing this verse and realized the law of karma is infallible. Therefore, they corrected their wrong behaviors and engaged in genuine practice for the sake of their liberation. Some people may wonder, given these stories, does it mean it's more common for a practitioner than an ordinary person to have a bad rebirth? Not really. In fact, ordinary people are even more likely to fall into the lower realms because they don't have the opportunity to practice. So, they tend to commit more severe wrongdoings. As you know, a lack of conviction about the rarity of human life will obstruct subsequent practice and hinder your progress on the path to liberation. Therefore, it is very important that we first carefully examine ourselves and analyze the 18 freedoms and advantages one by one. In a way, this is how a primary school child does their homework. We carefully check whether we have this freedom or not, or if we have that advantage or not. This in itself is the so-called practice. Some of you have followed this advice and practiced accordingly yet felt nothing. This means you have not really focused on the practice. If you meld each piece of teaching with your mind stream, you will definitely generate faith in the Dharma. Practicing Dharma doesn't mean meditating with your eyes closed or having a direct vision of a deity in a particular form. What I just mentioned about reflecting on our freedoms and advantages is already the real practice of Dharma. Some of you didn't practice well the common preliminaries. You did the practice recently, but had no feeling. This means your practice is just a formality, and your practical experience can easily change or even regress. So before blindly assuming the forms of Dharma, it is important to first carefully check whether or not you have all 34 aspects of the freedoms and advantages. Some Dharma students at Larangar were very much looking forward to receiving ordination. For example, regulations require a 4-month probationary period for ordination, but they couldn't wait. 2 or 3 days after the probation started, they asked, "Can I get ordained now? I don't want to wait any longer. May you shave my hair and formally give me ordination?" Therefore, only halfway through the probationary period, such a Dharma student became a monk or a nun. This person was very happy, saying, "Thank you, how comfortable. I don't have hair left anymore. Am I cute?" This novice monk or nun probably thought having no hair left is a sign of ordination. They didn't know that developing conviction in the mind is the key. Some Dharma centers also attach great importance to things, such as issuing a refuge certificate, giving a Dharma name, and organizing rituals. Although these external formalities are necessary, the most crucial point is to carefully examine your own state to see whether you have the 18 freedoms and advantages, plus the 16 additional conditions described by Venerable Longchen. Therefore, through this study, I hope you will realize that some of your practice is merely a display of formality without really engaging the mind. In fact, Once the Dharma has integrated into a practitioner's mind, their manners will be very different from someone whose practice is just superficial. This can be seen in many eminent masters. Once a practitioner has generated conviction about the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages, they will place great importance on transcendental practice for liberation, which is reflected in their speech, actions, and manners. They won't get busy with mundane, trivial issues, including watching television, films, or cartoons, because they know those are just deceptive illusions that lack any true meaning. Of course, it is hard to have all the freedoms and advantages during the degenerate age. If you have all of them, take a moment to rejoice and reflect deeply on each one, over and over again. Everyone should reflect on this. Have I ever examined my inner state for the freedoms and advantages? If not, as of today, you must carefully reflect on them one by one. I am not just paying lip service here. It's not that I never practice in this manner myself, and I only ask you to do so. As Longchen Nyingtik says in the 30 Pieces of Heart Advice, if we have listened to many learned masters and received deep instructions, have studied a few sutras and tantras without ever applying them, oh how pitiful, we are just fooling ourselves. Ever since I myself encountered this teaching, I have been putting it into real practice. If we do not put the ngondro teachings into real practice and instead focus on other practices, our practice will be off track and can hardly achieve any substantial progress. Therefore, this is what we should remind ourselves. Now that I have finally attained these hard-to-find freedoms and advantages, I will not waste them, no matter what. I will commit to practicing the true Dharma. This human life is indeed very rare to find. In terms of its causes, to obtain a precious human life, we must have upheld pure precepts and had pure faith. As said in Nagarjuna's precious garland, having faith dispels the states without freedoms. Upholding precepts enables a good rebirth. In terms of its conditions, we must have practiced generosity, generated supreme aspirations, and so forth. In addition, by reflecting on its metaphors and nature, a precious human life is indeed very hard to obtain. We are fortunate to have a human form in this life, and if we want to get a good rebirth in the next life, we must uphold pure precepts. If we want to uproot defilements including greed, anger, and ignorance, accumulated since the beginningless time, we must practice with this human form. Vasubandhu says, to attain a good rebirth, it is important to uphold precepts. To uproot defilements, it is important to practice Dharma. Some people complain about their heavy afflictions, saying they've read many Dharma books and recited the Diamond Sutra many times, but their greed and anger persist or even grow stronger. Well, it is because they have not put the teachings into real practice. If they engage in real practice, afflictions will absolutely go away. This will definitely happen because practicing Dharma directly antidotes afflictions. It's as when a fire is fierce. Coolness will naturally disappear. Therefore, we should be highly motivated to practice the Dharma. As Pacho Rinpoche says, the authentic Dharma is just around you, so there's no need to seek it elsewhere. Some people are always unable to have a successful practice. They switch from one teacher to another, from one monastery to another. Sometimes when I listen to their stories, I can only remain silent. Why is this happening? It is because they have not established a solid foundation. They rarely reflect inwardly, but only seek outwardly, so wherever they go, they cannot have a successful practice. In fact, everyone can have a successful practice. The key is whether a practitioner is willing to devote enough effort. For example, if you devote enough effort to the practice of the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages, then you will be able to practice the Dharma steadily for a few decades, which will without doubt lead to success in your Dharma practice. But if your practice is just so-so, if you give up halfway after a few attempts and lack patience and perseverance, then no matter which practice you engage in, it won't turn out well. Especially while studying the Dharma, if you intentionally stop receiving transmissions or become unwilling to practice, this is the so-called obscuration of Mara. Padmasambhava gave a supreme instruction to Yeshe Tsogyal, in which he said, "Whatever brings obstacles to one's practice, be it internal or external, is the obscuration of Mara." For example, if you want to receive a transmission, but someone else dissuades you from hearing it and suggests you leave, this is an obscuration of Mara. Mara doesn't necessarily take the form of a ferocious devil. Sometimes it may appear as a friendly Dharma fellow, or a loving and caring teacher who seems to care about you so much. After hearing his words, you may be so enchanted that you do not feel like sleeping for 3 or 4 days, feeling comfortable and warm in your heart. When you close your eyes, his smile and look appear in your mind. Nevertheless, if this person brings obstacles to your practice, then whatever he appears to be, according to Padmasambhava, is an obscuration of Mara. Dharma students should stay cautious about this. As mentioned earlier, you must check your own state carefully first to see whether or not you have all 34 aspects of the freedoms and advantages. If you find some aspects are missing, you should strive to your utmost to acquire them. At all times, you should make sure to carefully examine whether or not you possess all freedoms and advantages. Of course, such an examination doesn't only last 1 day or 2. You should examine your own state anytime and anywhere in your life. Many senior practitioners set a great example for us. Their practice is not constrained by time and place. In the isolated forest, they always engage in their daily practice. In an urban setting or in a hospital, their practice never stops. Place and time do not constrain these practitioners. By contrast, some practitioners practice well when staying in a quiet forest and remain firm and steady like a statue of an arhat. However, when they come to a metropolitan area, they stop their daily practices for many days. Those who left Larangar for somewhere else during the term break, please reflect on this. You are supposed to recite everyday prayers such as the prayer of good actions. But I have heard that some of you who are visiting other places don't chant the prayers at all for 2 or 3 days. This means the external environment has had a great impact on you, and you don't practice diligently. To be honest, I like practitioners whose practice is not influenced by place and time. For them, practice becomes a habit, so it's just like taking meals on a regular basis. Whenever and wherever they are, they hold on to their practice. This is true perseverance. In summary, you must check the freedoms and advantages all the time. If you fail to check, and any of these elements are missing, you will miss the opportunity to truly practice the Dharma. It's just like driving. Even if a driver is skilled and all the other conditions are present, with a broken wheel or without gas, the car still cannot move. Nowadays, some people don't have a successful practice, so they ask for divination everywhere, seeking answers to questions like, why is my practice substandard? Why can't I attain signs of progress in the practice? Why have I not had a direct vision of my deity? Actually, your unsuccessful practice is because you don't have all the causes and conditions, among which the 34 freedoms and advantages are the most crucial. If one of those elements is missing, your opportunity to practice might be cut off. Therefore, you don't need to ask around. The problem with your practice lies here. If you don't have any problems with the freedoms and advantages, your practice will definitely go smoothly. Therefore, it is very important to know this pith information. After all, accomplishing even a minor everyday task requires the coordination of many mutually dependent causes and conditions. So, how could the practice of the true Dharma, aimed at achieving the ultimate goal and benefiting both oneself and others, not require the conjunction of many interconnected factors? For example, when Tibetans were traveling long distances, it was common for them to brew themselves some tea along the way. The making of tea requires many different elements, such as the pot, the water, the wood, the fire, and so on. Just lighting the fire itself is impossible without a flint, steel, tinder, the traveler's hands, and other necessary items. When I was a kid, many Tibetans made fire in the traditional manner with a flint, a small piece of white rock, and some tinder, a velvet-like material made of a specific dried white flower, and steel. Tibetans normally put all these in a pocket, and when it is time to make fire, they rub the steel against the flint, and when sparks fall on the tinder, smoke immediately rises. They add a bit of dried grass or paper, and the fire starts to burn. If the traveler is missing just one thing, such as the tinder, either used up or wet from rain, then even if the flint and steel are in perfect condition, it is of no use. As a result, he is left with no other option but to abandon the idea of making tea. Similarly, without the presence of every single element of freedoms and advantages, the true practice of Dharma becomes impossible. For example, if practitioners have heavy afflictions, they may, at first, practice well in a sangha, but later their negative emotions take over. They start to lose their temper. They cannot get along well with their Vajra brothers and sisters. And then they leave the sangha. From then on, they put aside all the other sequential practices. Therefore, through direct or vicarious experience, a wise person will realize that each of these elements is indispensable. It is indeed a great pity to lose the opportunity to practice the Dharma. Therefore, now that we have all the favorable conditions and freedoms, we must seize the opportunity so we won't regret it in the future. There is a verse in Chandrakarti's introduction to the Middle Way that the great Jigme Punsok Rinpoche really liked. If, when free and dwelling in a wholesome state, we make no effort to remain therein, we will fall into the depths and then, deprived of freedom, how shall we escape and rise again? When we are free and have favorable conditions as a human, we don't guard our body, speech, and mind with mindfulness and vigilance, and we don't practice diligently to antidote afflictions. Once we fall into the 3 lower realms, we are completely under the control of our negative karma. So how can we escape and rise again? We should contemplate this scriptural evidence again and again. Some people often say, "I am too busy to practice." In fact, as long as you appreciate the precious human life, you can certainly find time for practice. Otherwise, time flies quickly by. As said in the sutra, the human form is hard to attain and easy to lose. The time easily flits by and is hard to capture. Once we squander this human life or commit wrongdoings with it, it will be harder to regain the human form than to scale the sky. The Brahma's Net Sutra says, once we lose our human form, we will not regain it even after 10,000 kalpas. Therefore, we have to rely on the qualified teacher's teachings and the sublime being's supreme pith instructions, and then develop a self-rescue mentality. Each of us should check our state to see whether we should meditate on the difficulty of finding the freedoms and advantages. Without real practice, just listening to the teachings is not enough. There is a big difference between hearing and practicing, as well as between knowing and experiencing. We should recognize the difference and then truly engage in the practice.